Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, book review. So I'm going to try and be upfront about the fact that I don't really know a lot about the history behind this book, or that is to say, to the extent I've researched it, I've just kind of come away confused. But I'll talk about what I have been able to figure out. So this book is a Russian novel. It's on the shorter side, like if you compare it to Tolstoy or the brothers Karamazov. This is less than 300 pages. But it was published in 1862, and it had a big influence on kind of the Russian radical scene afterwards. So this has come up in reference to the other books I've been reading on kind of 19th century Russian radicalism. For example, at one point I was trying to read What Is to Be Done by, how do you pronounce this? Turgenev, which is another famous Russian radical book. I actually never finished that book. Consequently, I never reviewed that book. I was borrowing it from a library, and then I was moving towns, and I had to give it back to the library. It was a bit of a slog anyways, to be honest. But in the publisher's introduction, it mentioned that this was one of the books Turgenev was replying to. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just go back and read the books that he was replying to first of all. Yeah, this book also kind of comes up in a lot of histories of 19th century Russia or whatever. So the central theme of the book, it's called Fathers and Sons, and it's about the generational conflict between fathers and sons, specifically the liberals of the 1840 generation kind of conflicting against the radicals of the 1860s generation. Now, in the book, the philosophy that the son is enamored with is nihilism. Is it nihilism or nihilism? I don't know. Nihilist, nihilist. Now, there's a publisher's introduction by none other than Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin, I just got done talking about because I was reviewing his biography of Marx. But Isaiah Berlin, I think, I actually don't have my copy with me anymore. I think this was the Penguin edition. If you can track this down, Isaiah Berlin's publisher's introduction is quite interesting. Although I'm sure any publisher's introduction will be illuminating. But Isaiah Berlin kind of talked about the publishing history of this book. And he says one of the reasons the politics of this book is so muddled is because everything was so tightly censored in Tsarist Russia. Turgenev, the writer, was under pressure from his radical friends to kind of include more radical politics in this. But he was also under pressure from his conservative publisher not to include radical politics in this. So, the impression I got from Isaiah Berlin's publisher's introduction is that the political philosophy in this book, nihilism, didn't really exist. It was something Ivan Turgenev made up. I published a review of this book on Amazon back in the day, in which I essentially complained that this is stupid, it's a political philosophy that doesn't even exist. And somebody actually replied to me and said, actually, nihilism, was a big thing in Russia in the 19th century. There was a movement, and there's a whole Wikipedia article on it, which you can read. So yeah, I don't know. I since read another book called The World That Never Was, which was about kind of 19th century radicalism. And in that book, they made the case that actually nihilism was not a big thing at the time that Ivan Turgenev published Fathers and Sons, but it since became a big thing afterwards because all these young people were reading Ivan Turgenev's book and thought that the nihilism of the main character was so cool that they kind of went off and kind of formed their own nihilist groups or tried to emulate this book. So I guess if that's what happened, then this book really did have a big impact on 19th century Russian history. Although if you read the Wikipedia article on nihilism, they do not draw such a straight line between this book and the nihilist movement. They kind of include Mikhail Bakunin, and there's a guy whose name I forgot. He's on the Wikipedia entry. Sergei Negevov or something like that, who was at one point one of Mikhail Bakunin's associates. And I think Mikhail Bakunin later parted ways with him because this guy was clearly a bit unstable, who apparently also kind of popularized nihilism. Anyways, suffice it to say the politics of this book are a bit confused. I think, again, relying on Isaiah Berlin's publisher's introduction, I think what was going on is in the 1860s, there were a lot of radicals in Russia. Not necessarily nihilists, but there were social democrats, socialists, and anarchists who were beginning to emerge in Russia in the 1860s. Generally young people, and generally these young people were conflicting with their fathers from the 1840s generation who had been kind of more liberal Democrats or kind of liberal Republicans or reformers. So whether this works or not, I don't know. The young heroes of Turgenev's novel are nihilists, and they believe their duty is simply to destroy everything in front of them. And then just leave the creation of the new society up to the next generation. This is the political philosophy of the young radicals in the novel. So they repudiate Tsarism and the serfs and the peasants, they repudiate Tsarism and the church, but just as much they're against the peasants and the serfs, kind of the traditional heroes of the left. They're just kind of against everything. I thought that this kind of weakened the story because it loses a bit of its punch if you're just doing a made-up ideology. But again, this gets back to the question of, was nihilism a made-up ideology or was it really a thing? I don't know. At any rate, it's an interesting book about generational conflict in Russia at the time, which may or may not have a basis in political reality. And it's short. So, you know, if you don't want to read Tolstoy or Tolstoy or the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, yeah, sorry, I'm having a mind blank. Then you can read this book in under 300 pages and then brag to your friends that you got another work of Russian literature checked off. Yeah, I don't know. In short, somebody let me know in the comments if you know anything about nihilism and the history of it and kind of how realistic this novel is. The impression I got from the publisher's introduction was that nihilism was not a thing, but Turgenev kind of made it up because these publishers wouldn't let him talk about actual radical ideologies like anarchism and socialism, which were popular at the time. But then apparently nihilism did become a thing later in Russian history, is my impression.